Story 1. World War I was called the war to end all wars. World War II was also seen as a nobody would ever be stupid enough to do this again type of situation. We do not learn. We simply regroup and allow sociopaths to become our leaders. Story 2. Made this comment in another thread, and it applies here. A lot depends on how it ends. The gravity of the situation is hardly understood globally. First, let's prepare some groundwork. While the front has been fairly stagnant, still moving in Russia's favor for the most part, it is easy to think this war is going nowhere. However, what people sometimes forget is that Russian soldiers don't need to enter Kiev to win the war. The Ukrainian state just needs to be placed in a position where it cannot continue to fight, leading to a collapse of the front lines, and the norm we are accustomed to will be gone. Now, let's go over a few things that people are aware of but may not fully comprehend. I believe I am not overestimating by stating that Russian daily casualties have been above 1,000 on average for quite some time. For comparison, that means every 3 days of war, the Russians lose an equivalent number of people to those who died during September 11, 2001. Before anyone challenges me, casualties do not only mean deaths, and I assure you that is already considered. 1,000 is actually a low estimate for daily casualties. If people believe that Russian medical logistics are anything like those of a Western military, I think they are very mistaken. The reason is that it is cheaper for these Russians to die. It causes less strain on the system and results in fewer payments for families if soldiers are missing rather than injured. More often than not, injured Russian soldiers either commit suicide or get pushed back into combat to die as the expendable resources they were intended to be. Now that we have addressed the scale of deaths, let's discuss what actually happens under Russian occupation. Unlike many other wars, where the aggressor tries to conceal their war crimes, it's quite the opposite here. There is overwhelming evidence of what has happened in locations like Bucha and Irpin, as well as many settlements and towns that have been deoccupied by the Ukrainian armed forces. What happens includes torture chambers and towns where entire populations are imprisoned in school basements. There are places with 2 lists on the walls. One with the names of individuals who perished due to inhumane conditions, and another with names of those who were executed. We know about the thousands of abducted children that Russians boast about on state media. It's worth noting that some of these children are sent to locations closer to the United States than to Ukraine. These are just a few examples. I could go on about the numerous misconceptions surrounding this conflict. One of the most important things that is becoming increasingly evident is how people view Ukraine. This isn't some ragtag army barely holding back the Russians. Ukraine has the largest army in Europe and the most updated military technology regarding drones. Ukraine produced over 1 million drones in 2024, and there will likely be double that number in 2025 or close to it. It's not just about quantity but quality as well. Between Ukraine and Russia, they are far ahead of the world in drone software. It's not just that drones are cheap, they are effective. It is a constant game of cat and mouse regarding who will innovate the next drone. What people don't realize is that this matters. Every month, there is a new drone or counter-drone. To conclude my lengthy discourse, if Ukraine loses, all of this will benefit Russia. We will not see a weakened Russia. Instead, we will witness an emboldened version. A new version that occupies and controls all of Ukrainian infrastructure, which has thus far prevented mass atrocities. This does include individuals as resources, as we have proof that anyone can be forcibly recruited into the Russian army. The first people sent to die by Russia in 2022 were, as you might guess, residents from Crimea and Donbass who, over 8 years, were indoctrinated or coerced into joining the army to fight against their own nationality, killed by their own people. Story 3. Do you think Trump's actions will help bring peace? Russia has no desire to stop. They are currently shipping more weapons. Story 4. Peace does not occur simply because conflict ends. If the world allows Russia to have what it wants, Russia will only desire more. The only way to achieve lasting peace is through a Ukrainian victory and a change in Russian leadership. Nothing else will lead to a favorable long-term outcome. Story 5. I am wondering how far the Trump administration has to go before the United States military refuses to accept its authority. Would they march on Canada or Greenland? Would they agree to be used by Russia against a country that is only defending its sovereignty? I am doubtful of both. I have an idea that we may witness a military-led insurrection before either situation occurs. Story 6. The war in Ukraine will eventually end, followed by a period of calm before another conflict arises elsewhere. It is a tale as old as time. Story 7. Phase 1. Begin rearmament. Continue undermining countries west of the current border with Europe. Phase 2. Covertly deploy troops into the country west of the current border and initiate actions against any representatives opposed to Russia. Phase 3. Issue a statement denying Russia's involvement and asserting that the local population has the right to self-determination. Continue interfering with democratic processes. Phase 4. Express concerns about anti-Russia sentiment in the West. Phase 5. Invade the country west of the current border, claiming a mission to maintain peace and protect the pro-Russian majority. Repeat as necessary. Story 8. I think it depends on how the war ends. If Russia overtakes Ukraine, they will soon start a new invasion. If Ukraine reclaims its territories and pushes back Russia, they will try again as soon as possible. Story 9. If it results in forcing Ukraine to give up its land to appease an aggressor while undermining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, I believe we will continue to see Russia attempt to expand back to its Soviet Union days. This was evident years ago when the Russian Olympic opening ceremonies were a giant red-clad tribute to the former Soviet Union. My mother is a baby boomer and the daughter of a Marine who remembers her teacher stopping algebra lessons because there was no point in learning math when the Soviets were on the verge of launching a nuclear holocaust during the Cuban Missile Crisis. She is quite baffled by how a significant portion of the country seems eager to get comfortable with one of the United States' longest-running ideological enemies, led by an ex-KGB oligarch who imprisons or murders his opponents. Story 10. My sincere hope is that with the European Union stepping up support, Russia and Putin ultimately fail, leading to Russia's collapse and Putin being removed from power. This would signify a reset of the world order. Story 11. If Ukraine wins, we will have peace. If Russia gets what they want, then there will be more war in Europe and China will be emboldened. Story 12. I hope Russia fully collapses and Putin is dragged out in chains while every Ukrainian gets a chance to confront him before he is thrown into the mouth of a volcano. He is a menace to society. Story 13. Palestine and Israel are still fighting. Story 14. Putin is not finished. He wants more territory, and with Trump in power, he can achieve it without concern. China will seize Taiwan, and North Korea will be emboldened against the South. Story 15. That depends on how the war ends. If Russia is defeated, there will be peace. If Ukraine is defeated, there will be a new conflict along the eastern border of Europe once Russia has rebuilt its military. If it is a stalemate, the conflict will resume once Russia has rebuilt its forces. Story 16. There will always be another conflict somewhere in the world that we will focus on next. Unfortunately, world peace is not possible. Story 17. If European troops are on the ground in much of non-NATO Eastern Europe, it could work. Without that, it's just Trump rebuilding the Soviet Union for his ally. Story 18. A frozen conflict like Korea currently. Because of the war, Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine are two different worlds, ideologically, culturally, and militarily. Russia has heavily militarized and culturally modified the East, while the West has become a hub for Ukrainian nationalism and North Atlantic Treaty Organization-aligned activities. There is no way to reconcile them anytime soon, so Ukraine will likely be divided into two. Story 19. Donald Trump is contributing to the deterioration of one side of the war, not the end of it. This is to justify the start of World War III. Story 20. There is a significant amount of money to be made from war. It is easy to circulate money during conflicts. War will never end. There will always be a reason for it. Story 21. Higher prices for the end consumer are inevitable. Regardless of the outcome of the war or any other global event, the primary concern for business owners is to increase profits, resulting in higher costs for everyone. Story 22. According to many economists, Russia will be too old to wage wars by 2030. Hopefully, it will be the end. If not, Peter Zehan will have some explaining to do. Story 23. Iran is the next target. There are plans to cripple the region because Israel wants them destroyed. Story 24. Extensive terrorism occurs as individuals realize that anyone can manufacture one-way attack unmanned aerial vehicles, which are essentially just airborne improvised explosive devices. Story 25. Depends on how it ends. If Russia conquers everything, they will start looking for their next target. If Russia is repelled, it is less clear what will happen. Perhaps there will be discussions involving the United Nations and NATO, and then the oil embargo will be lifted. Story 26. We might have to wait for Russia to invade Ukraine again or for China to invade Taiwan. Additionally, there is the situation in the Middle East where Iran could take various actions. Story 27. It's not Russia to watch, but China. If Ukraine is forced to accept a poor peace treaty, I imagine an insurgency will follow. That insurgency is likely to be secretly funded by Europe and will not be pleasant for Russia. Either way, I don't think Russia is going to regain its glory days in terms of land and power. It lacks the technology and financial resources, and the West is now arming up to counter it. For me, it's all about China and when it goes after Taiwan, which analysts likely believe is the best time to act as soon as possible. If this happens, China will have crossed a line and, if unchecked, can assert significant power over a large part of the world. The only factor keeping China in check is oil. China requires a vast amount of oil and currently imports large quantities. If Russia built pipelines or if China was able to source oil reliably from other regions, it could effectively do whatever it wants. Time-wise, China may see itself as Japan did before Pearl Harbor. For Japan, one of the crucial reasons for its aggression was the lack of domestic metal resources. It needed resources to compete with other world powers and decided to take them from China. In terms of China, I think they perceive themselves as a ticking clock, with an aging population and not enough young people to sustain the economy. If they do not move against Taiwan soon, America may regroup under a different president, as might Europe, and their aging population, along with advances in artificial intelligence and robotics, may reduce jobs, causing their economy to falter. Shockingly, it appears that little could or would stop China from invading Taiwan with Donald Trump as president. Story 28. Russia wants to reclaim all the Eastern Bloc countries it lost. Trump will likely assist the Russians. Story 29. It will be quiet for a while. Russia will continue to spread misinformation, possibly influencing some elections in Europe while rebuilding its military to seize more territory from Ukraine. Hopefully, Putin will no longer be in power, and his successor will not pursue a new Soviet Union. Additionally, it is important for the United States to elect a stable candidate who is not aligned with Russian interests. Story 30. I don't think it will end quickly. Europe understands the consequences of allowing Ukraine to fall, and anyone with common sense in the United States does too. Story 31. I believe Russia will take the opportunity to rearm, learn from the mistakes made during the invasion, and attempt to act again in a few years. This may buy Ukraine some time to prepare, but unless they join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or have peacekeepers, I am unsure if they can be more prepared than they were at the onset of the conflict. Legitimizing Russia's conquests sends a clear message that if you are a nuclear power, the norms against expansion may not apply to you. This could lead to countries developing their own nuclear weapons primarily as a deterrent. Other nations might pursue their own territorial ambitions. It is difficult to determine the outcome, but it is likely not favorable. Story 32. This is impossible to say because we don't know how it would end. Russia is not going to back down anytime soon, particularly not with the United States now yielding to Putin. So either Ukraine gives up and signs a peace treaty that results in losing half their country, in which case Russia allows what is left to live in peace for a few years and then breaks the treaty for a third time and takes what remains. Or Ukraine keeps fighting, and the European Union cannot support them enough, leading to Ukraine's complete fall. Or the European Union steps up in a major counterpush against Russia and the United States, which could end in two ways. 1. Russia surrenders and the war ends. The United States enters the war on Russia's side. These are just a few examples, and most of them have sub-examples. It is an extremely complex situation with numerous potential outcomes. Story 33. Trump is preparing the United States for a major war, aiming to secure key areas of interest for raw materials and strategic locations, such as Ukraine's minerals, Gaza, Greenland, and Panama. He is bringing crucial industries into the country to reduce reliance on external sectors, such as semiconductor manufacturing from Taiwan. He is cutting costs wherever possible and is even considering withdrawing from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization if the other member countries do not follow his lead. He is enacting laws and executive orders that restrict the press, ban protests deemed illegal, enable the removal of firearms from individuals deemed mentally unstable, and impose the death penalty for the murder of police officers. All these actions are intended to maintain control over opposition within the country. I might be completely mistaken, and the United States may become more isolationist, but this is my perspective. Feel free to return in 4 years when Trump may be campaigning for a third term or potentially not holding elections due to a declared state of war or emergency. Story 34. If Russia decides to withdraw and Putin is no longer in charge, peace may be possible. If Putin gains control over Ukraine, he may continue rebuilding the Soviet bloc. Story 35. Depends on the kind of peace. Peace, as Trump understands, it will not last long. Here in Europe, every country near Russia is investing heavily in its military. Story 36. I believe crime will increase wherever battle-hardened and traumatized ex-servicemen, women, and civilians begin to experience the effects of their trauma if no help is available for them. Story 37. It will likely result in Ukraine losing Kursk, Russia annexing everything east of the Dnipro River, and a fraudulent government being elected with assistance from Vladimir Putin and Elon Musk. Then, a year or two will pass while Russia reorganizes, rearms, and misleads its youth with misinformation, while Ukraine weakens due to the loss of United States support. After that, Russia will invade again and take the rest of Ukraine. Story 38. Any action that gives Putin more power will not lead to anything remotely close to peace. It will lead to more conflict. Story 39. It depends on how it ends. If Trump succeeds with Putin's plan, the Russians will focus on the genocide of Ukrainians and prepare to strike the Baltic states. Story 40. Nothing leads to lasting peace. There are far more individuals who, given power, abuse it than there are good people. Story 41. Other countries will see the outcome of giving up nuclear weapons in exchange for not being invaded. Nuclear weapons programs will begin in almost every country in the world, and we are far more likely to see nuclear weapons used. Wait, that's already happening. Story 42. It depends on how it ends. Either way, it will become quiet while Putin rearms and rebuilds. In a couple of years, he will push limits again. Story 43. Russia will invade Europe and China will take Taiwan first, then turn its attention to Australia. The United States will stay out of it because the former president is a coward. Story 44. It depends on how it ends. If Ukraine, by some miracle, manages to push back Russia, they will continue to come. If the North Atlantic Treaty Organization decides to help Ukraine and puts Russia in its place, then we may have a chance at peace. If Russia takes over Ukraine, they will come for the rest of the old Soviet Union next, and World War III will erupt. Either way, glory to Ukraine. Story 45. Putin will push south and attempt to rebuild the Soviet bloc, just as he has repeatedly stated. Story 46. The war in Ukraine will not end now because the majority of Ukrainians do not want to end it. Even if it does end, it will be unfair, forced, and will not lead to lasting peace. Aggressors must be punished, not rewarded. Story 47. Peace in Ukraine will be a temporary lull while Russia rearms and regroup, having been emboldened by former President Trump to act without restraint. This is just the beginning. Russia, China, and now the United States may become territorial aggressors by force if necessary. The world is fundamentally changing. Story 48. Europe should start treating the United States as a potential adversary. With Republicans likely to dominate power for the foreseeable future, their strategy will focus on weakening the European Union at every opportunity. They have no interest in a strong Europe, actively oppose the European Commission, and will increasingly align with Russia while sidelining and pressuring former allies. Story 49. China and Russia both engage in a form of incremental conflict, pushing boundaries to irritate without provoking action. Once people become accustomed to this behavior, they escalate their actions. However, China and Russia employ different tactics. China relies on intimidation, while Russia resorts to brute force. The end result remains the same: we take action, grow weary, and then they move to the next step. There is no reason to believe Russia will stop at Ukraine. Story 50. The likelihood of a world war in the coming decade grows as we watch post-World War II institutions and treaties continue to crumble. Story 51. I am Polish. Let me explain the situation. Many other nations have no idea how it works. Being here, I observe a Soviet-era mentality in people over 60 years old. I hear from those who studied Russian history and philology, understand Russian and Ukrainian culture, and have interacted with Ukrainian people. I have learned about the history of politicians who specialize in international relations, such as Radek Sikorski. I have also explored numerous monuments and museums that relate to the atrocities that occurred here up to 40 years ago. I have heard of Russian propagandists and sociologists and their influences on the current regime. The decimation of our government in the Smolensk catastrophe in Russia in 2010 contributes to an experience that is unique compared to living in the Czech Republic, Croatia, Greece, the United States, or Australia. In Poland, we recognize that Russia is not an ordinary country and should be treated as an enemy that can never be trusted because its goals are openly imperialistic. Russia promotes its culture through active destruction and deception, seeking submission. Its people are more isolated and radicalized than in other countries, understanding only strength. Russia exploits the system to achieve its objectives and perceives friendliness as weakness. Other countries seem unaware, though former Eastern Bloc nations are more cognizant. Many nations attempt to reason with Russia using common negotiation tactics that work with more cooperative countries. They extend too much benefit of the doubt, and Russia takes advantage of this, incorporating Western friendliness into its strategy. We understand that the leader aims to restore Russian glory and that the Russian people are willing to make significant sacrifices for him, which seems unfathomable to those in the civilized West. It is akin to knowing a compulsive liar and bully who grew up as a street thug involved in multiple crimes, and suddenly finds themselves in a college setting with wealthy peers. These privileged students who have only seen violence on television think they can cooperate with him, believing they can all get along. However, those who truly understand how it will end recognize the futility. This is Poland's view of how the rest of Europe engages with Russia. We are grateful for people like Sikorski, who can raise awareness among other European Union leaders. From the news, it seems we are among the few nations with a clear perspective on the situation, and our forecasts on Russian intentions appear to be accurate. Other leaders are not accustomed to dealing with this type of crisis and often fail to comprehend it because their experiences differ. Like Macron attempting to persuade the Russian leader not to invade Ukraine. It reflects a misunderstanding of the reality, similar to a fictional scenario where a character implores another not to act violently. An example of this misjudgment was Germany sending helmets during the initial weeks of the full-scale invasion, while we promptly provided Ukraine with tanks that were prepped in advance. To answer your question, the Russian leader will regroup, maintain a wartime economy to rebuild lost equipment. His Soviet stockpiles are empty, and he lacks sufficient armor and artillery for new assaults. Their military production is just beginning, currently producing only a few dozen tanks monthly. Ceasing military investments would lead to a severe economic crash. He will likely rebuild in 5 to 10 years, continuing to radicalize his people against the West, using the experience gained from the current invasion, before moving on to Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, or possibly another Ukrainian region if they do not receive adequate protection from Europe. This next move will involve modern equipment, such as drones and armored vehicles that are no more than 10 years old, rather than outdated models. Given recent developments, he may also receive support from other nations. Story 52. It depends on how it ends. If Ukraine wins and Russia gives Ukraine all its land back, Russia will fall into a very serious depression. Within a few years, maybe a decade at most, there could be a civil war in Russia or a massive overhaul of their political landscape. If Russia wins and annexes Ukraine, they will leverage the resources to rebuild themselves and then look to conquer more neighboring countries, perhaps eventually sparking a global conflict where the European Union fights Russia. Who knows what the United States will do by then? Maybe Donald Trump Jr. will be president, and the US will be dismissively claiming that the European Union started the war. Story 53. I fear we are steering towards an era dominated by war and imperialism, with Ukraine at the very center of it. American apathy and a peace deal that benefits Russia will prompt Xi to take Taiwan. It will lay the groundwork for Russia to take the Baltics in a couple of years. I also believe Trump's threat today about annexing Greenland is meant seriously, even if people are laughing. The three major autocratic powers of the 21st century, China, Russia, and the United States, will carve up the world. Unless a significant economic downturn occurs and Trump is removed from office, Europeans need to unite and triple their support for Ukraine so Russia goes bankrupt within a year. Story 54. It is up to Europeans. If they stand together and take their military capabilities seriously, they do not need the United States to help them stop Russia from advancing further west. However, the will must be present. Story 55. Right now, the war will either end in a Russian victory supported by the United States military, which will likely escalate into an attempted conquest of Europe by the new Axis powers, or it will result in a temporary ceasefire while Russia recovers and prepares for a renewed offensive in a few years. Story 56. Russia surrendered in World War I to Germany and vowed vengeance from that point onward. Significant change can only occur if Putin and his ally are removed. If Ukraine falls, Eastern Europe is at risk. Story 57. The momentum of war is what is keeping Russia from collapsing. If Ukraine achieves peace, the rogue state will have to initiate a conflict from Serbia. Russia cannot afford to stop maintaining its military forces. Story 58. I believe Russia and the United States are systematically attempting to take control of countries until they dominate most of the world. Story 59. There will likely be more conflict. The presence of numerous superpowers with nuclear weapons diminishes the likelihood of an all-out war. Consequently, our tolerance for the actions of one nation towards another will change, and not in a positive manner. Story 60. One sure thing that will happen is that Putin will feel rewarded and say, okay, sure, I didn't get the whole of Ukraine. I didn't get all the things I initially wanted, but at the end of the day, I got part of the territory, and I got the exact pawn I wanted in office in the United States. Given that aggression has been rewarded, Putin will likely feel tempted to act again. Where and when will depend on various factors. It seems most strategic from his perspective to wait a bit, perhaps a few years. First of all, practically, he has suffered heavy losses in personnel and equipment. He needs to rest and refit. Next, more deviously, he needs to reward national populist figures, Trump being the foremost, as they serve his interests and were instrumental in his aggressive actions resulting in gains. He needs to give credence to the narrative of Trump, the president of peace. I doubt he will attack again during Trump's presidency. If economic issues bring the Democrats back to power in 2028 or 2029, then Putin may be tempted to undertake another military gamble. He will certainly probe and look for excuses, such as defending persecuted Russophone populations in Eastern Europe. Whether he will act again will depend entirely on how prepared Europe is to respond militarily and how well informed Putin is about that readiness. This is the complete wild card. He will use information operations to push Europe to its limits. They will attempt to spread the following sentiment as much as possible in every country through every available online channel. Why would I send my son to die for a country that is 1,000 kilometers away from me? The best way to turn this into policy is to get his national populist allies to repeat it continually, which they will do for easy votes and the promise of lucrative bilateral partnerships and cheap energy that would satisfy their constituents and further entrench them in power. Thus, he will particularly target his propaganda towards these national populists, both the leaders and the electorates, to undermine Europe's preparedness and lay the groundwork for whenever he decides to probe. If the Republicans remain in power after 2029, then Putin may choose a more gradual influence-driven approach, using a circumstantial alliance with U.S. intelligence to install pro-Russian figures across Eastern Europe and achieve his goals without military intervention. Let's see. Story 61. Nothing special about Ukraine, except that many countries will recognize the need for their own nuclear weapons. Story 62. What effect did the Ukraine-Russia war have on anything anyway? Global migration did not spike dramatically enough to have an outsized effect. People died during wars generally. Multiple countries had to reconsider their alliances and military positions. Hopefully, we are moving away from the role of the United States as a global police force. Story 63. It will encourage further land and sea lane acquisitions by aggressive authoritarian nations. Greenland, the Panama Canal, Taiwan, the Baltic States, Kuwait, the Suez Canal, and the South China Sea. Story 64. Depends on how it ends. If Russia yields and returns to the original border, we could return to a longer peaceful era. If not, Putin will just strengthen and attack the next target. Story 65. I predict that if Trump gets his way, the United States' global standing will be significantly damaged, and Russia will invade Ukraine again in a decade or two for the same reason bullies don't usually stop trying to take lunch money if you give it to them once. Story 66. I will quote Edward Kenway from Assassin's Creed 4. What is peace but a confusion between two wars? The conflict will end, and another will begin shortly once everyone has regrouped and rearmed. Story 67. Why would Putin stop? He is getting what he wants, and it has only cost him over 100,000 Russian lives. With Trump as the leader of the United States, he does not have to worry about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is the opportunity he has been waiting for his entire life. Story 68. Without security guarantees for Ukraine, Russia will repeat its past actions. That's why Ukraine is determined to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Story 69. I could stop all war, but we are not ready for it yet, and the underground militia would be far worse at this point in time. Story 70. There is no such thing as lasting peace. It will likely turn into a situation similar to that of Korea, with eastern Ukraine as a buffer state and Russia potentially invading again later. Story 71. Belarus will be taken, then Moldova, and so on, until the Soviet Union is restored as one entity. Therefore, it will lead to more conflict. Story 72. War is part of human nature. It has been with us as far back as we can tell. Expecting it to go away because we can share thoughts online is not realistic. Story 73. Once money cannot get you things because it is useless. Fusion power is the initial step towards unification. Story 74. Looking at it from an American and Russian perspective, I would like to think that if Donald decided to try and take Panama, Canada, or Greenland, or formally have a military alliance with Russia, we would be in coup territory. Even though the current administration is chaotic, I struggle to see a world where this situation is viewed positively and the military blindly follows that path. Russia, at worst, can be fought to a stalemate, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere. It is a simple numbers game. They do not have the manpower or the economy. However, because of this, would Vladimir drop a nuclear weapon? China deciding to take Taiwan would create a significant mess, and I really do not see a positive outcome at any level. Story 75. Russia will not settle for a ceasefire, and they will not stop with Ukraine. Even if they obtain the land and resources they are seeking under the current terms, they will rearm and return for the rest of Ukraine and other former Soviet states in the future, likely within a couple of years. Story 76. The reality is that until we have a unified system for everyone, conflicts will continue to occur. The United Nations is ineffective with its 5 vetoes on the Security Council. The European Union could serve as a model for the future, but there must be an authority with the power to enforce decisions when poor judgment arises. Story 77. Here's what I predict. Regardless of any minerals deal, Trump will refuse to provide any sort of security guarantees. Nobody would believe him if he did anyway. The fighting will continue. Europe will realize they can either fight Russia in Ukraine or fight him in Moldova or Lithuania. France and the United Kingdom will lead a large and complex coalition of peacekeepers into Ukraine that completely halts the Russian advance. Trump will call them warmongers, pull out of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and ban any American electronic communications or force coordination support. This will make the whole effort significantly harder. The war will end with an armistice or treaty that leaves parts of Ukraine in Russian hands, no Ukrainian membership in NATO, and the European peacekeeping force permanently in place. Over the next couple of years, Russian drones will constantly target peacekeeping soldiers. The Russians will deny any involvement, claiming it was a Ukrainian drone, and the peacekeepers will be powerless to do anything about it. This, combined with relentless Russian and pro-Trump information campaigns, will turn the European public against Ukraine. One by one, European countries will remove their forces as their leaders lose elections to far-right extremists. The war will then resume exactly where it left off. Story 78. Dictators like Putin have the advantage of staying in power without concern for election cycles. They can stop and start wars at their convenience, and in the case of Ukraine, agree to a ceasefire while Putin and Trump undermine democracy and stoke division in the United States and Europe for the next 4 years. They may rebuild Russia's economy and military, then attack Ukraine once again when Trump leaves office. The Republican Party can conveniently claim that this situation would not have occurred if Trump were still president, blaming their political opposition for the catastrophe they themselves collaborated to engineer with Russia and Putin. Within the next 4 years, the Republican Party may fully reveal their true intentions, ban political opposition in the United States, and plunge the nation into a fully authoritarian form of government. In that scenario, Trump and Putin could align their interests and invade any free country they desire. Either way, Trump's version of peace in Ukraine is not a plan for lasting peace, nor does it bode well for the prospects of freedom and democracy across the globe. There does not seem to be a military superpower or alliance able to stand against the combination of the authoritarian regimes of the United States, Russia, and China. Story 79. When Trump and Putin pass away, hopefully, there will be a new world order of calm, with elected officials not prioritizing their own interests. Until then, brace yourself. Story 80. I believe there is more conflict because Russia is not being held accountable in any significant way, and United States security guarantees appear to be ineffective, so why wouldn't they act again? There is almost no chance of lasting global peace, as that is just one small part of a world filled with largely competing developing nations that will have an increasing capacity to wage war against each other, coupled with only weaker alliances to deter them. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.